of chickens, they still continue to supply the United States' major fast food chains such as KFC and Popeyes without penalty. And this is just one example of how countless factory farms are secretly operating throughout the United States. Factory farms, concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs for short, are containment centers for livestock where livestock are raised and given food with little to no access to range or graze on land. However, they are able to continually deceive their consumers because of their influence in government contributions. The United States needs to increase regulation in factory farms because of their detrimental impacts on the environment, their inhumane treatment of animals, and the illnesses and health risks they impose on their consumers. Factory farms have been a significant component in the rapid production of meat in the United States since the 1900s. Due to the industrial developments and the population boom following World War II, the United States started experimental factory farms and slaughterhouses to increase their yield of meat. The U.S. began the shift away from farming centered around diverse crops and animals that ranged on land to farming that was to confined prisons where profit is the most important outcome. In the 19th century, Chicago's meatpacking industry began the industrial scaling of animal slaughter. The horrors and unsanitary practices were later exposed in Upton Sinclair's novel, The Jungle. His novel publicized the unsettling truth behind the meat that Americans were eating, but Congress still struggled to effectively pass legislation regulating the industry because of their accumulating wealth and influence. In addition, these slaughterhouses opened up other mechanized methods to slaughter animals in an attempt to accelerate and confine the meat industry. Factory farms especially boomed during the Green Revolution and Richard Nixon's presidency because of his emphasis on increasing the size and yield of farms. Factory farms were able to prevail as the main source of meat for the United States, and their rise encouraged scientists to experiment with animal husbandry, the manipulative breeding of animals to create the most desirable fatty animals. To keep up with the growing U.S. population, farmers began implementing feedlots in their process to create stockier, bulkier animals for their consumers. The meat industry further consolidated their processes to make it cheaper and quicker through economies of scale and vertical integration. Through economies of scale, they were able to lower their costs by producing meat on a massive scale. This involves housing large volumes of animals in tiny premises to produce large quantities of cheap meat. Similarly, vertical integration allows them to maximize their profits by owning all facets of production, and it allows them to have more control over the industry as a whole. This competitive atmosphere encourages the unethical and harmful practices because meat companies are trying to produce meat the cheapest and fastest to remain competitive. However, today there are various federal programs responsible for regulating the practices of factory farms and keeping them in check. For example, the USDA has multiple sub-programs that oversee meat production in the United States, such as the USDA's FDA, EPA, which monitors the pollution and environmental damage by factory farms, and the FDA, which ensures the ingredients in the food fed to animals are also safe for human consumption. However, the USDA still has not executed federal laws that protect animals. Despite the various associations involved in protecting the safety of Americans, there is still a lack of legislation restricting and penalizing them. This is mainly due to meat companies' political dominance and their efforts to limit regulation through lobbying. Also, it is difficult for these organizations to truly regulate all the farms across the United States, especially considering factory farms are often dishonest and opaque about their practices. Without public awareness and involvement, factory farms will continue to go ungoverned and grow stronger. To begin with, industrial farming's unsustainable practices pollute the environment and deplete its already diminishing resources. The transportation sector is one of the largest contributing factors to climate change in the world. However, the meat and dairy industry emits more heat-trapping gas than all the planes, trains, and cars in the world combined. From the beginning to the end, the process of factory farming constantly emits greenhouse gases and nitrous oxide with the production of feed crops, the manufacturing of fertilizer, and the shipment of products. Farmers begin by clearing vast amounts of land to grow feed crops, leading to deforestation and the release of stored carbon into the atmosphere. Deforestation of the United States' natural land for feed crops is extremely unsustainable and inefficient because the energy required is enormous. For example, the meat and dairy industry grows 67% of the crops in the United States, but only provides about 32% of the caloric content of the United States food supply. The meat industry takes over most of the United States agricultural land to feed livestock, while this land could feed more people with less environmental consequences. Additionally, the United States uses 55% of its fresh water to maintain factory farms and grow their feed crops, while simultaneously polluting nearby waterways. Just 1 pound of beef requires 1,850 gallons of water, while growing the equivalent amount of crops requires much less. Also, factory farms produce excessive amounts of animal manure, which, unlike human waste, is left untreated for fertilizer, creating an unmanageable abundance of nitrogen, bacteria, chloride, and phosphorus. To combat this, some factory farms store their animal waste in pits or waste lagoons, which are filled with liquefied animal excrement, bedding waste, antibiotic residues, cleaning solutions, and other chemicals. These structures commonly break and leach contaminants into the soil, eventually polluting both groundwater and surface water. Furthermore, when farmers use animal manure as fertilizer, precipitation and runoff cause it to enter nearby waterways. As a result, there are increased amounts of nitrogen in drinking water, and as the water eventually enters the ocean, it creates dead zones and kills marine life. Secondly, factory farms' rapid production of meat results in poor living conditions and maltreatment of animals. Animals raised in factory farms are forced to live in confined, densely populated, and poorly ventilated quarters, compiled with their own waste. Animals spend the majority of their time in cages being tied down or chained with minimal room to move around. For example, egg-laying hens are packed into tiny battery cages that are so small they begin fiercely pecking at each other's feathers and bodies. Tail docking, debeaking, toe amputations, ear tagging, branding, and dehorning are just a few examples of how factory farms continually inflict pain upon their animals. Although many of these physical altercations may seem minor, they often cause chronic pain leading up to the end of their life. This stress-inducing environment leads animals to have violent behavior, resulting in even more physical brutality from their handlers. To make matters worse, undercover investigators have captured the daily unprecedented occurrence of beating, throwing, dragging, and kicking of farmed animals. The overall toxic, crowded living conditions these animals must endure creates an ideal environment for violent strands and bacteria to thrive. To prevent the spread of these infectious diseases, animals are forcibly injected with antibiotics and drugs that not only have environmental consequences, but also present health risks in the public. Along with antibiotics, animals must withstand growth stimulants and feed additives that cause them to unnaturally grow and mature. Stimulated weight gain not only stresses out animals' bodies and immune systems, but many of the approved drugs have detrimental health effects. For example, ractopamine, a beta agonist drug, has been linked to various health issues in animals, including musculoskeletal tremors, cardiovascular problems, increased aggression, and physical impairment that leaves animals unable to walk or stand. Specifically, cows are injected with the growth hormone RBGH or RBST, increasing their likelihood of developing painful infections in their udders. With the continual use of drugs such as ractopamine, the spread of drug-resistant bacteria has increased and contributed to factory farms' dependence on drugs. There have been many attempts to expose factory farms and their cruel treatment of animals by the media. However, the resurgence of ag-gag laws and the criminalization of whistleblowers has made informing the public increasingly risky. Ag-gag laws criminalize reporters, researchers, and activists for acts of recording or photography without approval. With these efforts being stymied across the United States, the abuse of factory farms remains concealed and animals continue to be treated as production units rather than living creatures. In addition to disregarding animals' well-being, factory farms impose harmful consequences on consumers' health due to unsanitary practices and their reliance on antibiotics. Factory farms' excessive production of animal manure that is left untreated contains various pathogens and strands of violent diseases such as E. coli. However, the USDA does not stringently regulate the land application of this animal manure, but rather defers to state guidelines which are not always effectively or consistently enforced. As a result, waterways are contaminated with dangerous bacteria, and Americans are more prone to recreational water illnesses, causing symptoms anywhere from bloody diarrhea to death. Also, the cramped and constricted living quarters facilitate the rapid spread of new strands of diseases and zoonotic pathogens, which is further enhanced by the close proximity of swine and poultry facilities. Zoonotic pathogens such as the influenza virus, hepatitis E virus, and salmonella are present among swine, cattle, and poultry, leading to outbreaks and pandemics in the public. There are about 48 million cases of foodborne illnesses annually in the United States. Many of these cases linked to CAFOs. FDA investigators are denied access to their microbial samples, and CAFOs lack transparency, allowing them to remain free of culpability and punishment. Furthermore, factory farms are influencing the spread of emerging infectious diseases because of animal and human viruses' ability to swap genes through recombination, creating new potentially dangerous strands. Contagion and the exchange of genetic material are only amplified with the enclosed and overpopulated environment. So factory farms need increased standards and surveillance of hygiene to stop the spread of these pathogens, especially considering it is difficult to get rid of these viruses after the meat packing process. Rather than creating a more sanitary and expansive environment for their livestock, meat companies rely on antibiotics to limit the spread of these diseases, creating yet another concerning risk for consumers. With the overuse of antibiotics and CAFOs as growth promotants and protectants against diseases, antibiotics used for human medical care become less effective and inadequate. According to the FDA, 70% of antibiotics important to human medicine sold in the US are used on the farm, mainly on CAFO animals. Additionally, factory farms' excessive use of antibiotics causes the creation of superbugs, which are resistant bacteria that cause higher rates of death from diseases that could otherwise have been treated. As meat produced by these large corporations is continually purchased, the effectiveness of antibiotics that are crucial to treating diseases and infections diminishes. Despite these threats towards Americans, the meat industry is still not required to report their antibiotic usage details, making it difficult to discern if they are really using them appropriately. If the government implemented binding regulations regarding sanitation and surveillance of diseases in factory farms, industrial farming would be less dependent on antibiotics and allow the public to fully benefit from antibiotics' medical contributions. CAFOs need to put less emphasis on maximizing profits with neglectful and hazardous practices and put more emphasis on the health of the public. Due to factory farms' sole purpose and desire to hastily and cheaply produce meat, they burden the environment, various animals, and Americans' health. There are many claims that refute the amending of factory farm structure and decreasing meat consumption in the United States. One of the most common concerns is that people will be deprived of their essential protein sources. Meat, specifically red meat, contains various important nutrients, and it is high in protein. However, with high intake levels, over 18 ounces per week, Americans are at higher risk of obesity, excessive weight gain, and cancers. Despite meat's nutrient density, reducing the consumption of meat in one's daily diet can actually diminish the development of these diseases. According to Piedmont Healthcare, there are many other protein sources that vegetarian athletes eat to meet their nutrient needs, such as chickpeas, beans, quinoa, and lentils. Additionally, the meat industry has compromised the quality of their meat by using cheaper ingredients to keep prices low and meet their demand. As a result of soy and corn-based diets versus pasture and dried grass, the meat produced is not as nutrient dense as meat from grass-fed farms and is less efficient in helping people reach their protein goals. Another opposing claim states that factory farms are essential because they feed the population with their rapid production and wide availability. Factory farms did contribute to the growing population of the United States during the Green Revolution, and they allowed lower classes to have more access to meat and high protein sources. However, their high water consumption and expansive land use is depleting vital resources that are needed for America's future. And for other food crops that help feed the population. Other crops such as cereals, fruits, and vegetables use considerably less water. For example, it takes 4,325 liters of water to produce 1 kilogram of chicken, while it takes 1,644 to produce 1 kilogram of cereals. Along with their dependence on drinking water, throughout their production process, they contaminate nearby waterways and continue to shrink America's water supply. In 2019, slaughterhouses released more than 28 million pounds of nitrogen and phosphorus directly into the rivers nation's directly into the nation's rivers and streams. And in 2015, the EPA reported that meat and poultry processing facilities were the largest industrial contributors to nitrogen pollution in the US's waterways. With the decreasing supply of Americans' drinking water, it is necessary that America take conservatory action, starting with the meat industry, to ensure that they can support future generations. Also, in order to feed their livestock, factory farms intensively grow feed crops, which can instead feed America's population. The energy and resources needed to maintain factory farms and produce feed crops simply does not equate to the energy that is gained. Also, the dominance and competitiveness of factory farms have driven many locally owned farms out of business and caused many farmers to go into unemployment. Specifically in Iowa, large hog farms control the market because of their ability to invest in the latest technology and mass-produce meat at lower costs for consumers, negatively impacting small business agriculture. Although many people claim that factory farms create numerous employment opportunities, they simultaneously cut farmers out of the equation and diminish their wages. All in all, Americans need to become less dependent on processed meats from factory farms as their main protein source because of the lasting and adverse effects. They are constantly contributing to many of the United States' major environmental issues such as contamination of water, climate change, depletion of natural resources, and greenhouse gas emissions. Their unethical and unsanitary practices not only exploit animals, but continually jeopardize Americans' health. Yet despite these endangering consequences, the government has failed to effectively regulate and penalize factory farms and continue to inadvertently support them. However, there are various measures that Americans individually can take to help reduce these effects. If people become more flexible and creative with their diets to include more plant-based proteins and start buying local meat from grass-fed farms, America can begin the shift away from factory farms while also supporting local farmers. If giving up or limiting meat consumption is simply not achievable for everyone, even just limiting fast food consumption to once a week or only cooking with meat from local farms can still contribute to this change. People can easily find local farms near them through sites such as Market Wagon, or they can visit their local butcher shop and inquire about how they source their meat. Additionally, if the government stringently enforced the already existing antitrust laws that prevent mega mergers and allow small farmers to be able to compete with agribusinesses, then consumers would have a wider variety of meat to choose from and not just have to pick from meat made from factory farms. Also, the government needs to enforce existing environmental protection policies such as the Clean Water Act instead of allowing them to carelessly produce meat with the current weak regulations. Overall, with Americans' participation in government reform, the United States can improve the factory farm system and reduce the threat to our environment, our population, and our animals. Thank you for coming to my speech. Oh, sorry.